Alrighty, so in this episode of AoV Shower Thoughts, we are going to take a look at Enzo the Heretic's Bane. So, for the video today, I'm going to talk about three things. Number one, his splash art, as always. Number two, his character design and in-game model and how well it stacks up against his lore and story and the role he is supposed to fulfill within the AoV universe. And finally, I want to talk about what does Enzo add to the AoV universe in terms of him as a character. What does it add to the plethora of other characters in the universe that they're trying to build? So first of all, let's talk about the splash art. Not a lot to say here. The splash art is perfectly competent, no glaring errors. It's interesting. The background's cool. There's a bunch of demons that Enzo supposedly killed with his weapons. He's standing in a huge cathedral-esque building that reflects his character well because he is a man of faith and pious religion. So I think it's cool. You get to see a nice full body shot of Enzo. Yeah, the splash art is cool. I was going to say maybe give him a little bit more dynamic motion within the art, but then again, I also thought about it, and I think that knowing Enzo's character and how he's more of a stoic, quiet, icy character in a sense, he isn't going to show a lot of emotion or a lot of dynamic posing within his splash art. I think the splash art does a perfectly fine job. Not a lot to say here. So with that out of the way, we're going to talk about his in-game model and how well it stands up against his lore. Now this is where we start to run into a little bit of an issue, but I'd like to give a little bit of a disclaimer first. I don't think Enzo's design is bad. I think it is perfectly competent. I think it is sleek and well done. The animations are fine, but I just think, there are several things that they could have done differently to make Enzo better. Because when we look at Enzo's character and compare it to what his lore is supposed to present, I think there is a bit of a disconnect as to what Enzo is being represented as. Because first of all, we know Enzo comes from the Temple of Light. In his lore, it says very specifically he was raised from when he was a young boy to have pious faith and pious belief within his religion and within his faith. He is raised to be this very religious person through and through, very devoted to the temple, right? Almost brainwashed in a sense, I think this is where they missed a little bit of this characterization, because two things. Number one, we look at the color scheme of his clothing that he has on, and also the golden designs, right? I think two issues I have with this is, number one, the color scheme is not really Temple of Light. And this is a bit of an issue, especially when you have to present a character, because thematically, you have to present them and make them instantly recognizable as any faction. The only reason why from the get-go I looked at Enzo and knew he was Temple of Light is because his clothing design doesn't look specifically Athenor/human. So you want to give more clear indications, and using colors like black and blue is a bad idea, because black and blue is often associated with Athenor champions. So Valheim, Richter, Quillen, those characters, those characters use a lot of black and blues, and the faction that they come from use a lot of black and blues, and I think ultimately Enzo shouldn't have used those colors because he is very devotedly to the temple, and I think Enzo as a character, his personality-wise, I don't think he would also wear these colors, especially because these colors also relate to you being a human, because the Athenor champions are human, and Enzo being this person who wants to be an embodiment of the light, and this person who chases down the heretics and kills the people who do not align themselves with the faith and religion of the Temple of Light and their teachings. He kills these people. So ultimately, I don't think Enzo would actually want to present himself as human, almost in the sense. He almost wants to erase his identity and become this figure, this voice of the temple, this character who is supposed to be the embodiment of the light, right? And I think that the color scheme doesn't work with him. So I think ultimately what they could have done is just stick with gold and whites, because that's what the temple is known for. Their color scheme is golds and whites. Second thing is the design he has, especially with this stuff, the golden designs he has. I think the shape language is a little bit too complicated and too much going on. Two reasons why I think this is problematic. Number one, Enzo as a character, I think a large part of his character's personality is that he doesn't have a personality himself. He doesn't have an identity because his entire identity is built around the fact that he speaks for the light. He speaks for the religion. He is for the temple. Realize how he isn't anything by himself. His entire identity is built off of him being the embodiment of the temple and the religion he is so trusted in, you know? I think ultimately because of that, Enzo wouldn't have this costume, this robe, where he has all these designs that is supposed to make him stand out and individualistic. Because he doesn't want individual character in a sense. I think Enzo's entire character and motivation comes from his religion and beliefs, and ultimately I don't think a character like Enzo, who is so steeped in these thoughts and beliefs, he wouldn't have such unique and not unique but not so complicated shape language going on. I think his costuming ultimately missed out on a few opportunities, and this is especially frustrating when you look at the concept art, and ultimately I think the concept art has a lot better of a design. You know, I think this design communicates him much better. How so? Two main ways, right? I think, first of all, when you look at the costuming, this robe, it still is a robe and still very sleek and has most of the general shape language there, but the detailing communicates an idea way clearer than this one does. Because when I looked at this design that they ultimately settled with, I looked at it and I thought, yeah, that's a robe, but is it specifically religious? Or is it just a fashion choice? This, however, is very much so reminiscent of the robes of religious figures you would see in our world in the status quo right now, what they would wear, right? Much more simplified shape language, just this entire piece of simple white fabric. There's still enough details and enough character to make Enzo stand out as a unique, character in and of himself. He's not just an average person, but it's way simpler, and the shape language communicates religious figure, religious clothing much better. It looks like something a priest would wear. It looks simple enough, and it seems that it's something that Enzo would wear as a person who is so deeply religious. I think it just reflects it much better. Especially this piece they had for his shoulder and neck. It's almost reminiscent of what you would see like crusader, what a crusader would wear. And that's really interesting because crusader's cape, you know, the stuff that they wear, they would have the helmet and they would have this shoulder and neck piece that would be a cape and robe, right? I think that's also very interesting because Enzo's character is essentially a crusader. He is a person who is out to hunt the heretics for his religious belief, right? That's why his entire kit is centered around hooking an enemy and then throwing them back and catching them, essentially, you know? I think this is extremely interesting. If they settled with it, it would have been way cooler and way more thematically appropriate for a character who is essentially a crusader. Last thing I like to talk about is his hair. And the community gave a lot of crap for his hair, but I think his hair is actually one of the better parts of his design because it's simple and it is very, in a sense, utilitarian, neat, simple, not extravagant, and the color of his hair is blonde, almost white in a sense, very light blonde, and I think this is also interesting and thematically appropriate because colors that are light and that are, of a lighter spectrum, especially close to the whiter colors, I think the thematic representation of that color is purity. And I think this is interesting because Enzo seeks to be a pure man. He seeks to be the embodiment of the light, as I have said many times already. But it's also deeply ironic because in Enzo's lore, he originally was not so pure of heart. He originally started out as a character who essentially is, pure by day, and he seems to act very astute and, very normal and well put together, but behind closed doors he actually tortures and murdered people. And ultimately, I think it's interesting to have a character who thinks so highly of himself but also has a deeply, deeply messed up and dark past. Last thing I like to talk about is one of the biggest things I think the company missed out on, and this is the thing that actually bugged me the most. Since I can overlook a lot of this costuming choice, I can look over this just because I can still see some of this religious, symbolism of the robe and all. Just could have been better if they stuck with something simpler like this. But the thing that they missed out on really hit me hard, because if we look at two designs over, if we look at this, I don't like the costuming here because then again the black and the blue doesn't work, but if you look at his face, he has this piece of armor on, right? And I think if they kept that piece of armor, it would have been such a good choice because of this. In his lore, Enzo has a specific connection to one of the other characters in Arena of Valor, that character being Hayate. And Hayate also had a connection to the temple. And in Enzo's lore, he actually is actively hunting Hayate because Hayate is the traitor. He is the heretic that he is hunting down. And this is so interesting because Enzo despises the heretics. He despises this man who embodies the heretic, the man who abandoned the temple for his own purposes, for his own goals. I'm going to explain Hayate's backstory and design sometime else, but essentially, in Enzo's mind, Hayate is the poster boy of heretics, essentially. He is the exemplary figure that he must take down because he is everything he hates. Hayate is everything he despises. But the irony and the tragic irony behind all of this is Enzo once was on the path to become the same person that Hayate had become. It was only because of one decision of sticking with his religion, of essentially confessing his sins, that is the only reason why Enzo did not end up like Hayate. Because Enzo originally tortured people. If he continued down that dark path, he would have for sure left the temple or have been exiled. He would have become the same rogue that Hayate had become. Hayate left the temple because he felt the temple had betrayed him in a sense, right? So if they kept that piece of armor on his face, on his jaw, it mirrors what Hayate has, since Hayate also has the same form of armor on his helmet, on his jaw too. And I think it would have been so interesting for Enzo to keep that, because he would be the man who is pursuing this heretic, who is chasing this heretic, but the tragic irony behind all of it is they really are not that different. They really are the same person, just down drastically different trajectories because of one simple decision that they made, because of one thing in their life, right? Ultimately, it would have been extremely interesting to see this parallel between these really similar characters in nature and in execution. It's just that, one decision has changed them a lot and made them go in completely different paths. For Enzo to have that piece of armor, to have that thematic connection to Hayate, would have been so interesting. This ironic connection to the man who he hates the most, who he wants to kill the most, ultimately he has so much resemblance to, has so much thematic resemblance to. That would have been very interesting to see. I think the fact that they missed out on that is deeply a missed opportunity that I think they could have capitalized on to extend character development. Last thing I want to talk about in the video regarding everything is the new niche of character that Enzo has opened up a possibility to. So Enzo is a character who the entire premise can be boiled down to one word, which is religion or faith. And I think this is really interesting because the temple is a religious institution, essentially. Like Illumia, who's the seer of the temple, she is a god. Tulin proclaims himself a demigod, right? I think it is so interesting that they're finally creating a character who is centered on the religious aspect of the temple. That is so interesting and so good because it opens up a new niche, a character, right? Because Enzo is this Templar, this Crusader character who is out to hunt the heretics for not believing in the religion that he deems is the correct one, right? And I think they could expand a lot more on that. They could have a character who is at odds and at who doesn't personally agree with the religious teachings. They could have more characters like Hayate. They could have more characters like Enzo, but just expand the niche further. And I think that is something that Enzo does very well, and he is opening up a new door for these characters and for these new possibilities for characters. I just hope Arena of Valor would notice this and expand upon it, but there really is no guarantee. So with everything out of the way, I would give Enzo a solid A tier. Yeah, he would be a solid A tier design in my book, you know? Nothing is horribly wrong, the design is sleek, the animation is nice, the backstory is very good. It's just that they missed out on the very little things that could have really perfected him as a design. So yeah, there you go.